an attack on the freedom of expression enjoyed in France.
Exactement. Un an plus tard, le journal avait publié d'autres caricatures et puis on se souvient.
Very much in that same satirical tradition.
Le jour noir de l'histoire de la presse française.
Le fusillade qui a éclaté, je vous le disais, ce matin en plein centre de Paris.
They will publish their magazine next week on schedule.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media developments that we've been tracking this week. France reacts to a horror story, the shootings at Charlie Hebdo, expressions of solidarity over freedom of expression. They say timing is everything. The Turkish government says one thing about the media, then does another. We do our best to take an impartial look at the importance of impartiality and objectivity in journalism. And how many television technicians does it take to change a light bulb? The fatal attack on that satirical magazine in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, has quickly turned into a debate about freedom of speech. The edgy and provocative magazine exists in France only because writers and journalists there are legally protected in their right to do their work with sharpened and sometimes poisoned pens. The horrific killings of 10 staff members at the magazine seems rather clear-cut, a denial of that right. However, context does have a way of complicating what appear to be the simplest storylines. The context in this story comes in the form of what the magazine has published, and herein lies the difficulty. Al Jazeera has taken the editorial decision, and this goes back to those Danish cartoons in 2006, not to show the cartoons. Not because we fear reprisals, but because so many people, mostly Muslims, but members of other religions too, find the cartoons deeply offensive. Ultimately, this is a story about different cultures and what they are willing to tolerate in the so-called other. France has a tradition of satire that shocks and savages to an extent that would not be tolerated in other so-called liberal democracies. It's just what the French do. There is nothing that justifies the murder of any journalist or cartoonist over their work. But this is a story in need of explanation, and that's what we're going to try to do. Our starting point this week is Paris.
It was a ready-made meme. Je suis Charlie. I am Charlie. We are all Charlie. Journalists clicked that message of solidarity, and it traveled fast. But what were they expressing solidarity with, exactly? Because, as one writer put it, as the headlines screamed of attacks on freedom, to abhor what was done to the victims is not the same as to become them.
Very few of the people saying this have offended or published the same type of material that Charlie Hebdo does. Some newspapers have said, we would never publish this kind of offensive content anyway, so it doesn't make a difference. It shouldn't make a difference now whether we do or not. But I think as a simple expression of solidarity, you know, there is nothing wrong with the Je suis Charlie idea.
It's very easy and actually important to say that we sympathise with those who've been killed, that we oppose the brutal close-range execution of journalists. But it doesn't mean that we have to say that Charlie Hebdo is okay, that everything they did was fine.
It's a way of showing solidarity. But it is ambiguous, and I wouldn't use it personally. I'm not Charlie, I'm against the position, and I think, and I have attacked the position which was, in my opinion, very counterproductive inside our society. But at the same time, of course, they have the right to have it, and of course, nobody has the right to kill them. I mean, this is important.
The headlines come within a much broader context, which is none of us have yet begun to have a moment really to take stock of what's really happened and what this means. And so we seek ready answers, and one way of trying to make sense of it is to put it within this bigger story that we purportedly understand, the bigger story of freedom of expression.
Charlie Hebdo has been in the news sporadically ever since 2006, when it made the point of publishing the Danish cartoons that offended so many. 5 years later, after the publication's offices were firebombed, the Paris bureau chief for Time magazine wrote, "Defending freedom of expression in the face of oppression is one thing. Insisting on the right to be obnoxious and offensive just because you can is infantile." So yeah, the violence inflicted upon Charlie Hebdo was outrageous, unacceptable, condemnable, and illegal. But apart from the illegal bit, Charlie Hebdo's current edition is all of the above too. Commentators in the media are usually loath to speak critically of the dead, especially of the victims of such a cruel mass murder. Richard Seymour, an author and academic, was the exception this past week when he wrote, "The argument will be that for the sake of good taste, we need a decent interval before we start criticizing Charlie Hebdo. But given the scale of the ongoing anti-Muslim backlash in France, and given the ideological purposes to which this atrocity will be put, it is essential to get this right. There's a critical difference between solidarity with the journalists attacked and solidarity with what is frankly a racist publication."
What I mean by that is there's a kind of cynical, in my opinion, whitewashing going on of this publication, which did produce some quite crass, adolescent, racist material. And we should acknowledge that. And it doesn't justify anything that took place. It doesn't necessarily even explain what took place. But it does put into context the reaction that we're going to see now, the reaction that we're already seeing. So in order to even start this conversation properly, we just need to acknowledge that there is a problem.
It's a magazine which is offensive, certainly, but it is equal opportunities offensive. It will mock Christians, it will mock Jews, it will mock Muslims, it will mock anyone in French society. It is not particularly geared towards offending one group. It satirizes everybody equally.
Charlie Hebdo does go after just about everybody, but not necessarily equally. Look back at its cover stories from the past year and you will find a disproportionate number about Muslims, who make up about 7% of the French population. Satire is supposed to mock the powerful, and even when the magazine skewers right-wing fears over immigrants, it uses racialized images of pregnant Muslim women supposedly taking advantage of the French welfare state, women who tend to be more underprivileged than they are powerful. But, as we learned in 2010, it's not like anything goes at Charlie Hebdo.
When one of their writers, Maurice Sinet, wrote something disgustingly anti-Semitic about the son of the French Prime Minister Nicolas Sarkozy, the magazine quite rightly fired him. So they had standards, they have a moral compass. It just so happens that their moral compass didn't extend to the Muslim community of France.
France is a mostly Catholic country with a strong secular streak. Laws separating church and state were passed more than a century ago and remain in place. Many French Christians practice their religion, but see the lack of reverence for political and religious figures and the right to blaspheme as signs of a healthy democracy. However, those laws were written in a different era, with the Vatican and not Mecca in mind.
The Catholic Church was really an important political power, not religious. I mean, religious, of course, but also political. In this time, it was against democracy, against the Republic, etc. So the right of blasphemy was accepted in this context of struggle. Of course, today, it has a complete different meaning. But the law has not changed, and you can be with the right of blasphemy, and I am not in favor of changing the law in France and saying that some of the blasphemy are really counterproductive.
So it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Whether we should have the right to blaspheme religions. I think that, it goes hand in hand for me in terms of thinking about ourselves as developing mature democracies. And we have to, have the responsibilities, it seems to me, that go with those rights within a mature multicultural democracy. And so I think that the right to say this or that has to always be one that we interrogate and we think about, and we don't just take it for granted that actually we have the right to say anything.
In the early 1990s, a term coined almost a century ago came back into vogue: the clash of civilizations. The idea that people's cultural and religious identities would be the primary source of future conflicts. The term was trotted out again this past week. But is that what really happened in Paris? Is a conflict between a relative few who use their mighty pens to provoke and defend, and a few others who use the gun to murder and silence, is that a clash of civilizations? Or is it just a clash of an uncivilized few? That's something the politicians dealing with the aftermath and the media reporting on it might want to keep in mind.
On the download this week, our viewers weigh in on the story and the coverage in Paris.
Let's say a magazine is based in the United States and is run predominantly by white middle-class Americans, and they choose to run a cartoon that depicts other white middle-class Americans as fat, lazy gorillas. There's a difference between that and that same magazine depicting African Americans as fat, lazy gorillas. My point is that you cannot sit at the top of a socio-economic power structure, push the people at the bottom, and say that I have the right to offend you, but you do not have the right to be offended, which is what this magazine was doing.
Plenty of us have been critical of the magazine for a long time. We do not say, "We are Charlie," because many of us believe satire should punch up, not down, and that the negative media portrayals of Islam play a large part in the divisions within French society. Violence is never a valid means for expressing disagreement, but I believe events like these don't mean we should silence our criticisms.
Other media stories on our radar this week. The 3 Al Jazeera journalists imprisoned in Egypt have their respective cases headed for a retrial. And one of them has made a more direct appeal to the Sisi government on the pages of the New York Times. Mohammed Fahmy wrote an op-ed piece that the Times published 5 days after the retrial was ordered, in which he said that he and his colleagues Bahar Mohammed and Peter Gresta are pawns in a geopolitical struggle between Egypt and Qatar, which funds Al Jazeera. He also blamed their imprisonment on the war on terror, writing, "I would like to remind Mr. Sisi that journalists are not enemies but allies. We expose the truth about the terrorism he is striving to defeat." The Al Jazeera 3 have been in jail for more than a year now. All are awaiting their retrials, although Fahmy's legal team wrote another op-ed published by the Huffington Post, which argued for his immediate release. Tunisia is known as the birthplace of the Arab Spring. It's also a place where comments you make on your Facebook page about politics can land you in jail. Yassine Ayari, a Tunisian national based in France, was convicted in absentia by a military court 2 months ago. He was arrested when he returned to Tunisia and jailed for defaming the army and insulting the high command. During the recent election, Ayari supported one of the losing presidential candidates and published posts attacking the eventual winner, Beji Said Essebsi. He was also highly critical of the defense ministry. In one post, he alleged the ministry had failed to act on intelligence before an attack in which 16 soldiers were killed by militants 6 months ago. Usually, international law prohibits civilians from being tried in military courts, but Article 19 of Tunisia's Code of Military Justice allows up to 3 years in jail for anyone who commits outrages against the flag or the army. The U.S.-based Human Rights Watch says of that law, as long as such laws remain, those in power can't resist the temptation to silence criticism and dissent. This is not worthy of the new Tunisia. The next time the Turkish president decides to declare that his country has the freest press in Europe, he might want to pick a day when his police aren't arresting a journalist. On January 6th, police in the mostly Kurdish city of Diyarbakir raided the home of a Dutch reporter, Frederike Geerdink. Geerdink broke the news herself on Twitter, saying, "Terrorism police just searched my house. Team of 8 guys. They take me to the station now. Charge propaganda for terrorist organization." She was later freed. Geerdink is a prominent voice on the Kurdish issue and contributes to a number of news outlets, including the Dutch Het Parool and the Independent newspaper in the UK. The raid happened to coincide with a visit to Turkey by the Dutch Foreign Minister, Bert Koenders, who tweeted that he was shocked and would raise the issue with his Turkish counterpart. And it came on the very same day that President Tayyip Erdogan said that depictions of Turkey in the Western news media were false, and that nowhere in Europe are the media as free as they are in Turkey. Just last week, a prominent television host, Sedef Kabas, was taken in for questioning after tweeting critically on the government's handling of a corruption scandal. As for that Dutch reporter, she has not exactly been silenced. She's back on Twitter saying, "So what do you do the morning after the anti-terrorism squad searched your house and detained you? You brew coffee and write." It's one of the things they keep stressing at journalism school, the importance of objectivity, impartiality, keeping the reporter's emotions out of the story. Easier said than done. In a world where bad news, war, poverty, terrorism leads the coverage, you'll be hard-pressed to find a journalist who succeeds in absolutely walling off their emotions and their opinions from the facts. And we live in the digital era. The internet has opened up an infinite space for a more partial, partisan style of journalism. So where will that leave old-school, analog-era reporting? Or can traditional journalism coexist with this new, more opinionated form? The Listening Post's Gauri Sharma now on some of the arguments for and against impartial journalism in the digital age.
According to the Oxford Dictionary definition, to be impartial is to treat all rivals and disputants equally. To be objective is to not be influenced by personal feelings or opinions when considering or representing facts. Most journalists strive for both, but should they?
Critics argue that impartiality can lead to a he said, she said style of journalism. I think that's a fairly simplistic application of impartiality and in fact is quite lazy journalism. True impartiality is about honestly considering lots of different viewpoints on an issue and letting the weight of evidence drive the story.
Scholars have come to say there's nothing called ultimate objectivity. And I think we're saying the same thing now about impartiality.
Forgive me. This is tough.
If you look around you and you report what is happening, as a human being, you will get involved. You know, it's by the nature of being a human being.
In 2010, CNN's Anderson Cooper was reporting on the ground in Haiti after the huge earthquake that ripped through the country. What viewers saw wasn't just a journalist doing his job. Cooper often got involved in the stories he was reporting.
Blood is pouring from his head. They hand him over the barricade. He's carried away.
Earlier this year, James Chow, a reporter with the Chinese broadcaster CCTV, couldn't contain his emotions while covering the missing Malaysian airliner, the MH370.
We had heard that some family could be leaving tonight to go to Australia. She hadn't been told that at all.
James. Thank you very much, James.
And in July, two reporters covering the same story, Hala Al-Safadi from Iranian channel Press TV and Al Jazeera Arabic's Wael Al-Dakhdour, both broke down live on air while recounting the number of civilians killed by Israeli airstrikes.
The whole thing is in the intent of the reporter, and if the intent of the reporter is to find out what's going on and not to get in the way of it and not to try and balance it in any way with his own or her own emotions or opinions, then you're onto something.
This type of journalism produces this sort of view from nowhere. Right now, for example, with this war we have on ISIS, we don't know where the media stands. What we do often see in the mainstream is that these retired military generals are repeatedly getting invited on to come offer their expert opinions on bombing ISIS, when a lot of these retired military generals have very close ties to the defense industry, and so they have a reason to want to be at war.
We need to put special operation forces in there.
It's very deceptive to not tell your audience or readers that that's the case.
But media outlets face a problem. Sticking to impartiality and objectivity doesn't necessarily make good business sense. Take the 24-hour news market in the US. The ones that have the highest ratings are the ones that have built their reputations on partisan programming. Fox News plays strongly to a conservative audience. Figures released by Nielsen's rating system for 2013 show that for the 12th year running, the network topped the chart with primetime numbers averaging 1.1 million. In recent years, MSNBC has recast itself as a liberal network with a strong Democratic viewer base. Its daily ratings stood at 640,000 last year. But MSNBC still came ahead of CNN, which prides itself with non-partisan, straight reporting, even though it doesn't do anywhere near as well in the ratings.
When it comes to an outlet like MSNBC, they say they lean liberal, but in reality it's more of like a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party.
And the Bush policies are the ones that put us in this rut.
Most people get that. I don't think it necessarily produces great journalism, which is not necessarily about just disclosing your opinion.
Fox News is not an objective news organisation at all. It's opinionated, biased, prejudiced, with a very small-minded view of this glorious, diverse world that we all share. And I think it diminishes the American television news audience. It diminishes the intelligence of that audience to just have opinionated journalism.
But news consumers are addicted to opinionated journalism, and the internet has allowed that to flourish. Publishing stories for an online audience has meant that journalists can be more transparent, building trust by linking out to their evidence and primary sources of information. Some of the names in this field include Brazilian activist collective Media Ninja, Ukrainian fact-checking website Stop Fake, and pro-Palestinian website Electronic Intifada. US investigative journalist Glenn Greenwald, who worked with former NSA contractor Edward Snowden to reveal the mass surveillance by US and British spy agencies, is another.
What Glenn Greenwald showed with the Edward Snowden story was that you can have partisan advocacy style of journalism and that the audience can actually benefit from that if it's done well. And what's really changed again in the digital age is that the internet has allowed journalists to lift the veil on the process of journalism.
Also because it's adversarial journalism, it's challenging power. And I think in the end that's the purpose of journalism.
The larger question remains, is anyone truly impartial? Can any journalist really separate their own opinions, emotions and ideology in order to report objectively? It's not a new debate, just a more prominent one, as all those voices on the internet combine to blur the lines in the world of journalism.
I don't think we've ended with the discussion on impartiality so far. I don't think we've ended the discussion on objectivity. I think all these discussions are going to be taking place still, and I think it's a healthy discussion.
The most important thing when it comes to journalism is holding people in power accountable. And I think that this idea of impartiality and objectivity actually ends up serving power rather than holding people's feet to the fire. I think that if you look at where journalism is going right now, you see, especially with younger people, they're more interested in independent media outlets and sort of in finding their own information. I think you can see that with the rise of social media. There's a hunger and an appetite for more honest reporting.
I still think that even with transparency, people really still rely on journalists to decode the news and distill information. The audience is still looking to a journalist to uncover information, but also to crystallise it for the audience. So transparency alone is not enough. Just linking to information is not enough. A journalist's job is still to assess the facts, to weigh them up dispassionately, and to come down where the weight of evidence exists.
More voices on the download now on balance in the world of journalism.
Objectivity and impartiality in journalism are the ideal, but we're all human beings. Therefore, our interest in a certain topic will start by listening to someone or having a point of view from something that we see. So our job as journalists is finding the whole amount of facts and giving voice to as many people as we can. Based on this, I don't believe that we can talk about objectivity and impartiality anymore, but about balanced and verifiable stories.
Finally, unless you're watching us via a satellite dish or on cable, there's a pretty good chance that you're seeing this through a digital or analog signal transmitted by an antenna that's at the top of a broadcast tower. Now, transmission towers are like any other piece of broadcasting equipment. Occasionally, they require maintenance, including changing those light bulbs that at night allow low-flying aircraft to see the towers. This is not a job for the faint-hearted or for anyone with a fear of heights. This next video comes from South Dakota in the U.S., where a technician named Kevin Schmidt has to climb a tower that's 460 meters high just to change a bulb before it burns out. He partnered with a production company called Prairie Aerial, which works with drones. The view of the American heartland has attracted almost 1 million views on YouTube. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.